Jennifer Molidor is Senior Food Campaigner at the Center for Biological Diversity, helping to lead the sustainable food initiatives, including the Take Extinction Off Your Plate campaign. Her recent article titled Creating a Just Food System That Protects People, Wildlife, and the Environment is what we're talking about today. Thanks for being here, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, and all the work you're doing, it's so great. So, before we get into the article, I was listening to a YouTube or a video that you had where you had talked about what we've learned, sort of a look back through the last year and a half, and what have was being revealed about the mainstream food system.
Yeah, so the COVID-19 outbreak really reinforced what we already knew, but it just kind of shone a spotlight on it, how the consolidated power in the food industry, particularly the meat industry, really puts people's lives at stake, and it puts our planet at stake in terms of the environment and even national food security, both for Canada and United States. So we learned about the weaknesses in our supply chains too, and made it dramatically clear how we are at risk, we're vulnerable due to industry actions that cause habitat loss and deforestation, and sort of break down these safety barriers between human animals and wild animals. But we also learned about the supply chain breaking down. I think we're really seeing that now. And so, for example, the slaughter supply chain breaking down. A lot of environmental organizations don't necessarily take on the slaughter work, and it's not pleasant to think about or talk about, but it's a really big source of environmental degradation. So when the supply chains were breaking down, animals were grown beyond their slaughter weight, and so they wouldn't fit in the machines, the industrial scale machines, and they wouldn't make it in time. So what happened was a process that was euphemistically called depopulation, where farmers were needing to slaughter animals on site, and this kind of is horrible to talk about and think about, but it's done by mass gassing, direct shooting, for example, and just as a horrible atrocity that's very traumatic for everyone involved, and this terrible suffering of animals, killing millions and millions of farmed animals, sort of shone a light on all of the things that are already happening. And then so the disposing of them, the burying of them, which can contaminate the soil and the water table and all this, sort of done in secret. There's not a lot of public transparency about where they were and how much and what the pollution was, and tracking that environmental harm and so forth. So we're thinking about the supply chain now for Christmas and that kind of thing. But in terms of animal agriculture, there's a really dark side to the breakdown of these sort of industrial scale supply chains. So that's just one of the things that the pandemic kind of illustrated for us.
Well, and it's important to shine a light on that. I think that especially if people are consuming those products, to think about what that slaughter process is. We look at these packaged pieces of animal and don't really connect it to an entire animal and an entire lifespan, and these machines that you mentioned that they have to fit into and transport and all of that. So in terms of the supply chain breakdown, I mean, I see that it's happening. I see that there's empty shelves again right now. But you know what? I don't really get how is that happening? Can you explain to us kind of how that's happening?
Well, we're at this industrial scale, right? So we're not a system that can function with regional sort of food hubs. And that's one of the directions that we need to go to, right? So this industrial level global sourcing, particularly of animal agriculture, just makes no sense. There's this really great meme of like transportation with two trucks passing each other on the road with timber, right? And it makes no sense where they're chopping down trees from one place to take it to the other place, and they're chopping down trees from that place to take it to another place, and so forth. Just sort of a joke, but it's actually very realistic in terms of how our system functions. And then when that comes to food, similarly, it also just doesn't make sense. And it's not a climate resilient system, as I think we're going to see increasingly. So focusing on communities and regional hubs for the food system, as well as other systems, is probably going to make a lot more sense. And it's going to be something that we need to do to be climate resilient.
I see. Okay, so in even things like beans, I guess, that they're being grown in one part of the country and then shipped over to another part of the country to be processed and that kind of thing. So you're saying more decentralized local agriculture rather than this big global centralized thing.
Right. Decentralizing is going to be very important for the survival of, thriving ecosystems as well as human communities.
Right. And then in terms of, so you wrote about this, this event that happened, the United Nations Global Food System Summit. So, on the surface, what were they saying that they were going to accomplish, and then but what actually is going on at that place and like COP 20, whatever we're at, COP 26. Like, there's these big kind of global corporate events that sound really great. Oh, they're going to take care of everything, but in fact, you're saying no, that's not our solution either.
Well, one of the problems with the UN Food Systems Summit is that the wrong people were invited, and I think that's true of COP 26 as well, where they're focusing on fossil fuel industry speakers, and the Food Systems Summit, invited like agribusiness, and they focused on that to the detriment of small farmers and more just food system initiatives and that kind of thing is really left out. And it feels kind of ominous for the future, and certainly isn't going to solve a lot of the problems. It's not, there's a disconnect between the solutions that are being proposed and that are coming from the very people that are causing the problems that we're trying to solve. And it's a failure to see the bigger picture, the interconnections, the exploitation of the capitalist system, of the former colonial system, of agribusiness systems, of industrial scale systems, of animal agriculture, and the exploitation of humans and wildlife and people and farmed animals and so forth, communities. And they're being left out. They're not being brought to the table. So what you saw with the UN Food System Summit was protest. People are not coming. They're refusing to come. And those are probably the people we need to listen to most. So it's a little bit frustrating to see some of the things going on at the UN Food Summit as well as COP 26.
Okay, so I worked with poverty issues for a long time and published a street newspaper and learned a lot about the diversity that there is out in the streets, just the variety of different people and different solutions that they have and how creative they are. And then, but politicians and kind of community leaders, well-intentioned, they would get together and they would say, well, we should do this for them and we should do this for them, but not inviting those very people into the room. And they used to say, they still say nothing about us without us. So like, just invite us in, hear what we have to say. We're the ones living with the problem. We have the solutions. So it sounds like kind of a similar thing, like the people who are actually the small scale farmers and the local agriculture people are not being invited to share their opinions about how food systems could work better. Is that right?
Yeah, one of the problems is you're inviting the exploiters, right, to lead the conversation about the solutions. So massive industrial scale corporate profits, and agribusiness and agrochemical companies are not going to be the ones who are invested in communities and justice because they profit from the injustice. So the solution to the problems in North American farming, for example, often they just look at one piece of the problem without trying to understand the bigger picture or how the moving pieces are interconnected. Trying to solve, for example, a carbon offset or a carbon sequestration without thinking about biodiversity or the community that lives around this, or how an intact ecosystem works, or how this affects wildlife, or how this affects land ownership and the communities functioning as a whole, families, and do women own the land? Do people of color own the land? How is the land being shared? How is this sustainable long-term? These kinds of things are not at the bottom line profit margins for agribusiness. And so trying to find a solution from them is really not in the best interest of most people.
And what is like what you see that they're the profiting from injustices that they are also involved with creating. What is the role of agrochemical industries in food production. Can you give us some examples of the kind of things you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, for example, agribusiness, agrochemical companies own, was it 94% of the seeds, something like that. And we're going to have a hard time growing food in the future without seeds, right? So, from pesticides, so on and so forth, what they're doing is harming wildlife. So for example, 90% of US waters and fish are contaminated with pesticides. And studies found something like 200 chemicals in the blood of newborn human babies.
Yikes.
Yeah. Animals like the California condor, green sturgeon, the detached slender salamander, polar bear, all different types of animals. Toxic chemicals increase cancer, they cause reproductive problems, health problems, they disrupt natural hormone cycles and so forth in fish and wildlife, but also in humans, right? And it's also affecting pollinators. So like the American bumblebee, we often talk about the honeybee, but we need to talk about the Native American bumblebee. Their pollination powers have nourished our ecosystems and sustained crops, and something like more than a third of the crops that we grow for consumption, human consumption, are really not possible without pollinators. So again, if we want to be climate resilient, if we want to survive into the future, we want to continue our cultural traditions and how we grow food, we need to make big changes fast and limit pesticide use. So again, turning to the agrochemical companies is not the smartest thing to do. 94% of our seed varieties have disappeared. 3 to 4 corporations own 50 to 75% of the world's seeds and pesticides, and it's getting more and more consolidated. People are suspecting that eventually, and not too far down the road, it's going to become like one company, sort of all these other little companies, but one company dominating the global food supply. And if you think about that in terms of national food security, or who decides who eats what, who can grow what, cultural food sovereignty issues, that's actually quite terrifying. And it's something that we need to break up. These monopolies in the meat industry and the monopolies in the agrochemical industry need to be broken up right away. It hurts everybody, the planet, it hurts, wildlife, it hurts workers, it hurts communities.
Yeah, the idea of putting all our food security into the hands of corporations doesn't sound like food security at all to me. So as consumers, what can we do? As consumers, I guess we can not give them our money with our food purchases, I suppose.
Yeah, there's this tension between individual action and large scale action. I'm seeing people kind of argue, well, the only thing that matters is systemic change, and we have to just fight for that. And then other people are saying, no, individual change is really important too. And it's very clearly both, right? One drives the other. We need to take actions. We need to fight for policy changes, but also relying only on policymakers to save us, it's just sort of not going to work. So we're going to need to get active in our communities, growing sustainable food, building grassroots movements like this, creating a rumbling to the system, and really focusing on, for example, agroecology, movements like this that do try to combine the intersections of a thriving human community that can coexist with wildlife and nature, that takes nature and ecology into consideration in terms of how we're farming, and doesn't act like we can just come along and extract from the earth with no consequences. Or that's somehow a lifestyle that we want to move to in the future. So moving towards this as individuals, as communities, is where it's going to start, because we cannot rely on politicians. But at the same time, we also have to fight very hard for political change, policy change. And if the UN and COP26 isn't going to do it, we're going to need to come up with a different solution, because we are in the situation where these calls, these warnings have been for decades. This is nothing new, right? The injustices certainly are nothing new. And we get promises of tomorrow, 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 tomorrow. And here we are today, and we're going to run out of tomorrows. we don't act soon. So the solution is not simple, but we definitely need a multifaceted approach that incorporates nature, wildlife, farmed animals, farming, humans, human justice, and really include justice in that. So we don't come up with solutions that are a lot of greenwashing. A lot of what's coming out of the USDA, for example, is vague, and it's voluntary benchmarks, and it's disastrously in denial. For example, the USDA head Tom Vilsack, for example, at COP26 or during COP26, said that the US, for example, does not need to reduce meat consumption in order to fight climate change, which is stunning considering that the US is one of, I think, the top 2 meat consumers in the world. It consumes 3 times the global average of meat. So relying on him to save us isn't going to work. And we need to push hard for the solutions that we need, but justice needs to be a part of that. And climate justice needs to be a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like there's any lack of science showing us the impacts of animal agriculture on all scales and on the environment. And it's interesting that you mentioned that it's not a new problem. But you know what? I'm old enough to remember a time before Monsanto. Monsanto, when Monsanto came on the scene, it was a real game changer. The whole idea of genetic engineering. I mean, we knew that farmers would sometimes create hybrid crops from seed splicing, but the idea of kind of industrialized genetic engineering on seeds, and then hearing Vandana Shiva sending out signals of warning us that this is where we're going to end up for decades now, right? So it's an old problem, but it's also it's not that old really. And maybe, I mean, I think part of the agroecology is also turning to like elders and indigenous folk who have memories of how to do this differently, right?
Yeah, we, have this thought, I think, here in the United States, where we believe that we are somehow superior to the rest of the world in everything that we do. And that includes farming. And then within the United States, that white people, non-native people somehow have, this modernized technology and technical solutions and that are superior, in terms of farming and producing food. And it's just not true. There are places around the world where we're seeing, like, the climate justice movement is being led by the global south, for example. Agroecology principles that take nature into consideration, both in North America and far beyond it, and consistently and traditionally and currently led by indigenous peoples. So, for example, with agroecology, to regenerate the soil, waterways, watersheds, ecosystems, human communities through food, the foodways and the wisdoms behind these principles, totally rooted in indigenous knowledge, today. And so there's even co-opting going on, like this regenerative agriculture movement, right? Like, this is inherently part of indigenous knowledge. And so, yes, turning to elders, listening to other people, including storytellers in this, the traditional foodways in terms of our solutions, but bringing these people to the table is also really, really important. And then also being able to recognize when this is being co-opted. So even like regenerative agriculture, for example, these practices that are in theory good are being co-opted by chemical companies, the big meat companies. They're trying, for example, to turn regenerative grazing into this climate solution. So we need more cows. So that's going to solve everything, that we can just sequester carbon and, kiss the soil, or whatever the documentary is. And there isn't really science to prove that. And what is really going on is that it's being used to continue business as usual. And that's what we're seeing across the board. And that is not what we need. We need, farming that listens to people who have been coexisting with biodiversity for tens of thousands of years and continue to coexist with the majority of the biodiversity, and get away from extractive systems and so forth. And we also need to avoid, the greenwashing still, I mentioned before from the USDA, for example, rather than come up with regional food hubs, incorporate indigenous knowledge, incorporate justice and land back movements and debt forgiveness and, um, increasing equity in terms of land ownership with, for example, Black community, rather than those types of solutions, justice and equity driven solutions, or solutions that are formed through agroecology and taking, intact ecosystems into the sort of consideration and big picture of living with nature, they're coming up with solutions like potty training cows as a way to reduce methane, right? Methane is US methane from animal agriculture is the leading source of US methane. And methane is like 86 times more potent in the short term than carbon. Methane is a big problem. So rather than, for example, our leadership in the United States coming out and saying like, we're going to have, commitments from this industry that's going to involve meat reduction, which is the largest source of methane. What they're saying is we don't need to reduce meat, and instead we can put masks on cows, feed them things that make them less burpy, emit less methane, and potty train cows. And that's not a big picture solution. It's also like there's that disconnect of thinking, if you can potty train a being, if they're sentient enough to potty train, the mass consumption of them and the exploitation of them and the ways that they're treating is probably horrific as well, right? There's that disconnect as well. But in terms of methane and climate solutions, rather than reducing the source of the emissions, they're just finding ways that are frankly ridiculous to look at one tiny little piece of the problem and not the bigger picture. So that sort of narrow tunnel vision is one of the obstacles to progress, I think, to get us out of this mess.
Right? Because it's not just the cows, it's all the chemicals that go into the production of the food, the massive amounts of land and the water resources and all the rest of it, right?
The manure pollution, what the impact on the soil, the, deforestation, the, shooting of wolves on behalf of cattle or shooting bison, this inability to take in consideration how the pieces work together is where we're failing, and we're going to continue to fail if we do that. And so a lot of people are calling for like, can we please bring all of these conversation together into a solution? And with the leadership that we have right now, I don't see that happening. So something else is going to happen.
It's true. But is there any leadership that has ever done anything differently? Like there's a vegan mayor in New York City, I think now, is it? So I think there's this monetary connection between governments and these industries, right? And probably lots of golf course conversations and clubhouse parties and that sort of thing. Like I just see the industry and government as sort of, they're so friendly that unless you get some vegans in there to kind of raise these conversations, and there, I don't see any motive. If people are personally invested in eating animals, they're also really resistant to trying to find these other solutions, or even admitting that eating animals is the problem.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful, of course, as a beginning. But I think that there are a number of other people that we can bring into the conversation that may or may not be vegan. And I think that will be helpful as well, because I think, in my work where I've talked to people, even some of the people who are in the farming industry, even some of the ranchers, even some of the ag scientists, if you really listen to them, some of them are saying, look, we need to back away from this, or we need a new system, or we need to eat less animals. Like, they'll admit that. They'll continue their work, of course, but there's that small opening there. Or as I said, working with tribal communities and their traditional foodways, which may or may not include, some animal consumption. At least they're making some of the connections, right? They're understanding that they don't want to be part of the exploitation. They're understanding that power over land and power over people and power over agriculture, exploitation from extractive capitalists is not going to help us survive in the future. It's certainly not going to help us thrive in the future. So I think there are openings for people who are recognizing that they really want their community to do well, that there's more to this than just profit. And so those are the openings. Having conversations at the community level as well. We're trying to do, like, for example, climate related food commitments from cities and municipalities and county level. And even there's so much lack of knowledge about the connection between food production and climate change. So these cities will, for example, have climate action plans or even food action plans. Have climate action plans will set a target for emissions reduction. And then we'll come along and say, like, look, got beef out of your city procurement, your city menus, your dining halls, your senior centers, your hospitals, your jails, and whatever. You could almost meet your emissions reduction just by getting beef off the menu, just by committing to not purchase beef. Or you could do that by doubling your veggie options, or cutting the meat that you purchase in half. And it just doesn't make sense to them. There's a real disconnect there too, between this idea that there's some sort of land out there outside of the city where food is produced, and then that's their problem, and then the city's emissions don't have anything to do with that. But really the menus and the food that we purchase anywhere, whether we're private individuals or we go to a restaurant or we go to an institution, those menus are informative, they influence policy, they derive from policy, they reflect policy. And so that procurement or purchasing or menu policy and the footprint of those menus is very impactful. And we need to make that connection between food emissions, carbon and methane and so forth, the greenhouse gases, and city and state and federal level procurement policies. And this is true at, even in your workplace, right? Your workplace can commit to certain menu policies, restaurants, zoos, aquariums, so forth. These kinds of commitments would be really, really helpful to reduce the impact that we're having on the earth, and not just for climate. This will trickle down or whatever. It will branch out to a better system that supports different types of food production, different types of, growing vegetables, for example. But then we have things like COP26, where they sent out menus ahead of time that was like, well, that it's better, right? There's some plant-based options on there because we've been pushing for that each year, every year, year after year, for them to take animal agriculture seriously, since, agriculture is a third of the global emissions and animal agriculture is half of that, something like that. It's time to take that seriously. So this year they sent out menus ahead of time, and we're looking at them thinking, well, it's hopeful. It's not what we want, but it's hopeful. But then it turned out that the actual menus that they were serving were something else. So first of all, it was about half were plant-based, half were like local haggis.
Oh,
a low footprint, and so this time in the menus, they included carbon footprint after each item. And so you could see the plant-based options have a very small carbon footprint. The meat-based items, particularly the beef or the haggis, had a very high footprint. But the question is, first of all, why even serve the high carbon ones at a climate conference, right? And then, yes, your menu is 50-50, but how many people are choosing the low carbon option, right? So again, why offer the high carbon option? 30,000 people are attending this conference, eating meals every day for a couple of weeks. That's a huge footprint, right? And just in terms of leadership and modeling, there's that. But on the ground, we heard from people, and they said it's actually very hard to get those plant-based options. So waiting in line, they get to the front, they weren't there, tracking this down, that kind of thing. So still, it's just like you want to wring your hands, because it's just a disconnect. But far worse than even this is the fact that animal agriculture wasn't on the menu in terms of policy solutions. It just wasn't even something that they agreed to or talked about or invited, or it wasn't part of the discussion. And to leave out this enormous portion of the global emissions, creation is just alarming and disappointing and frustrating, but it shows us like how much work we have to do, and that we can't necessarily turn to them for those solutions. It's going to have to be on the ground level, grassroots activism, community level, neighborhood level, because we just cannot rely on the global north driving these solutions. The global south of this conference was pushing hard, and they had to make a lot of concessions, and it really was a heartbreaking experience, I think, for a lot of people. And the walk away from it really is that everybody's supposed to come back next year and make stronger commitments. And we hope that's possible, but we need to turn up the pressure this year as much as possible. It needs to focus on agriculture. Menu needs to be part of that. And we need to come at this from a point of view that considers all the intersections that we've been talking about, and not just sort of potty training cows.
Right. What a waste of energy that is. And yeah, I mean, if I was organizing this conference, I would have like how to be a healthy vegan workshops for these folks as well. And, and talk about not only the environmental implications, but we're in the middle of a global health crisis, how much healthier we can be and how much stronger our immune systems are when we eat a whole food plant-based diet. So lots of work there to do. I wonder if you've heard about the plant-based treaty that Anita Krines and the Save movement are promoting at various levels, all levels of government, and then they had a presence, I guess, outside the COP26.
Yeah, I don't know too much about this. I've seen some important people signing on to this, and it sounds good to me. If it's gonna make some headway, then I'm all for it. But like I said, we need energy and grassroots advertising like that. There's a lot of times where treaties will be signed, commitments will be made, which is hard enough to do, and then there's no follow-up. So we have the follow-up as well, and we need to see actual change. I'm all for things that raise awareness like that, though, and the intersections, as you're saying, of health and the environment, a healthy people, healthy nature, it all goes together.
Yeah, I think one of the places where I take some hope with the plant-based treaty is they're getting it into city councils, and local municipalities, and it's a document. Then it has apparently they have all like 100 or 16 different ways you can change your school, and 25 ways you can change your workplace, and that kind of thing. So it's a really sort of document.
We need more of that, because like I'm saying, even just today we're talking about some frustrations with the Berkeley City Council and why they're not moving forward on what we're calling for, a resolution for plant-based food and reducing red meat, for example. And this is something I found with other cities as well, is that they're really focusing on infrastructure, energy, building walls to prevent sea level rise, things like this, and homelessness and the COVID crisis. And they're not seeing how these things are interconnecting. They'll talk about air pollution, for example, but they won't see the relationship with food. So yeah, the treaty is great. We need things like this to raise awareness and education, so people make a connection not only between food and the environment and health and whatever, but because all of these interconnections need to be brought in conversation with each other. But I still am really finding municipal work very frustrating. If people want to do something in their communities, some of the things that I recommend would be to build community alliances and groups and make it very clear to your city council members, your board of supervisors, if you have that in Canada, but your representatives locally, basically, that you want these commitments. And here's an example. If the plant-based treaty is going to be an example, there's quite a few things like that. There's a default veg option, for example, which shows cities how to work with menus so that plant-based foods are the norm and people can request something else, but this is just sort of across the board the norm without even necessarily drawing attention to it. Here's a whole bunch of delicious menu items, for example. So commitments to that, or a commitment to like 20% emissions reductions via food, for example. These are all great. We need so much more education, But on the other hand, as you said, the science has been there for a long time. The information has been there. So it's kind of a combination of people not making the connection, people not understanding the emergency, and then also needing some education. But then, of course, also the resistance, this is not a priority. Like this is often seen as a sort of a niche boutique issue. Like people want plant-based foods, that's your preference. But no, really, it is people want healthy communities. People want humane communities. People want communities that can feed themselves in 10 to 20 years. And so they're just not quite getting that message. I'm all for anything that helps them get it.
It'd be nice if the media and entertainment, especially, were to every time veganism is mentioned, maybe not make fun of it or pretend like the food we eat is only grass or plain tofu. I mean, it seems it's almost as if they don't know that we live the healthiest lifestyles and we eat the most delicious variety of food and we have the healthiest gut microbiomes. And I wonder about the influence of big ag and big pharma on the media, and not just commercials but content. Is that something you guys look at all?
Oh, for sure. You mentioned commercials because I'm sure you know as well that the money that the industry gets to do advertising, right? So that we normalize consumption of meat with this abundance of advertising. Sure. Yes, the media, that large block, is frustrating for sure. I'm thinking even just for climate, the way that they'll allow this sort of messaging about net zero by 2050 being a solution. It's just climate insanity. That's not a solution. It's not zero. We need more than zero. And certainly by 2050, we're going to be beyond this, right? We're going to be in real hot water by 2030. So anyway, they allow this messaging to go on. And then recently there was something, well, I won't say the name, but it was one of the major outlets where they were saying, we're just not sure if plant-based meats are better environmentally than, traditional meats. We just don't know. And that's nonsense. We do know. And so, responsibility in reporting isn't necessarily there. There's a lot of hogwash, so to speak, out there that is distorting knowledge. And yeah, sure, giving vegans a hard time. And, there's a lot of documentaries out there that are trying to work with that. And documentaries seem to be very influential. People are emotional beings, and documentaries can tell stories the way that newspaper articles can't. A lot of people are busy. They only read the title of the article. The documentaries you can sit down and watch, and it can move you emotionally, and you can see things visually, and it just really tells different stories. So in terms of a vegan movement, I think documentaries have been very influential. There's a lot of misinformation out there as well, but it can move the hearts and minds in a way that compels action. I can think of several key documentaries that inspired people that I know in my own life to make complete changes in every way, in how they grow gardens. They stopped eating animals. They are now like animal activists. These things can really tell a story and connect with us emotionally in ways that other information can't. As you said, again, the science is out there, but seeing a pig or cow suffering is going to be something that's hard to forget. It's going to lodge in your mind, and we are disconnected from how food is produced, how it gets on our plate. And so I do think that movies can tell that story, but unfortunately, they can also misdirect people. So there's the Kiss the Ground documentary, which gets close, but misdirects people. And I'm running into people so frequently in my life where people say, "Oh, what do? You do sustainable food? Have you seen this documentary?" And I have to go, "Yes, I have seen this documentary. I know what you're going to say, and let me correct you. That cows are not necessary for, the manure is not necessary in order to produce food. We don't need more cows. We don't need this many cows. And this is not a biodiversity solution to just no-till or add cover crops and that kind of thing. It's more complicated than that." So that's yet another long rambling answer, but for sure, I think the media has an influence on us. for better and for worse, and getting our story out there as much as possible about the connections between nature and farming and human communities and animal ethics and health and, you know, everything. It's all one kind of answer, right? There's all one just humane food system that we're working towards, and it does solve all of these things in different ways if we do it right. So I think, yeah, it's important to get that story out there, which is why I try to write so many op-eds and articles, and I think other activists do as well. We just want to kind of really, you know, educate people and provide more information and correct misinformation where we see it. So that's a constant battle.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing, isn't it? Yeah, and so do you guys are promoting, I guess. Do you write, is somebody there writing about specifically veganic, like how to do veganic agriculture?
We're not doing specifically veganic, but you know, I'm in many other groups that are focusing on that. But yeah, I've engaged with people who are like plant-based food advocates from the, coming from health, for example, and other fields. But they say, well, we do need some animal agriculture, right? Like we do need some of the manure, right? Like there's this is just this idea out there that you see so often from so many people that really believe that we need to farm animals in order to survive. And that's pervasive, and it's hard to walk away. There are some people, you know, subsistence people, farming and, you know, fishing and that kind of thing. But by and large, that's not true. So I'll do work in that right now. I'm putting together a website about myths about grazing and livestock grazing, cattle grazing, sheep grazing, where we do take on other solutions. Veganic is one solution as well, of course. And yeah, I'm on the board of a local group where we're really promoting veganic farming as a solution. And it's so interesting. It's so interesting, the opportunities, and we're doing that as a way of sort of trying to protect a local watershed.
Cool. Yeah, I live in a place where there's rainforests, and I mean, there's nothing but diversity in the rainforest, and the soil is rich and beautiful, and there's no animal agriculture going on there, right? I mean, the most depleted soil is in animal agriculture zones, right? So it's very interesting, this distance.
Right. To produce livestock at this large, or I should say farmed animals, cows and sheep, cows specifically, at this large scale, and to feed them, you know, with our climate, and particularly where I live in the West, which is arid landscape, and we're in a drought, and we're going to have more and more severe droughts as we continue because of climate change. This is not the landscape that these animals evolved with. They're not meant to eat all this. You can't just put them out to pasture and therefore it's all good and they're going to eat some grass and save the planet. This needs irrigation. It needs supplemental feed crops. Many of the systems that rely on for animal agriculture that are industrial, the mass majority of them, you know, 99%, also need feed crops. They're in the feedlot model. So we grow these crops, we drench them with pesticide, we completely destroy the soil for years to come. And the idea that that is necessary in order for us to survive is just simply misguided, but it's what we've been taught and normalized all of our lives. And it's going to take an interaction with the truth, with a correction, in order for that to be, you know, corrected on a wide scale. And so the question is, how do we correct that notion that somehow we need animals to produce food, we need farmed animals to produce food? It's just something people assume that even if you chose not to eat those animals, we somehow still need them to grow other crops. And really what we need is pollinators. So yeah, we need to question a lot of assumptions. And I think over the past year, a lot of people have started challenging and questioning a lot of different assumptions. And I think maybe that will continue. Unfortunately, that means we've also lost trust in a lot of our sources too, which can be a scary feeling.
Well, or certainly we're questioning how much we should trust, and that and maybe realizing that it's okay to ask some important questions when, and not just take everything at face value, right?
Mhm.
So I hope. I mean, I saw a tweet yesterday that said this is going to be the greatest. When we look back on this, it's going to be the greatest time of human awakening in our history. And one can hope, it's one thing or the other. Either that or we go extinct. I mean, one of those two things will happen, I guess. I'm looking at the screenshot behind you and this beautiful wolf that has a tracking device on it, I guess. They have deer. We have kind of urban deer where I live, and they put those, I think that's what it is. It's a tracking device. Is that a real picture?
Yeah. Um, which wolf is this?
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's one of our Lassen wolves. It's come down from Oregon. There's a wolf right now that I'm really not this wolf, but there's another one, OR 93 that I'm following. That's just so exciting. This wolf has come from Northeast Oregon, down through California, down across to the west, back, to the east, to the west and back. And now it's in the western part of Southern California, which is like 1,000 miles, more than 1,000 miles. And this wolf has crossed interstates. It's gone through ranching territory of people who hate wolves, and just keeps going. And so, yes, the wolf is being tracked. I know there's a lot of controversy about the collar, but at the same time, it's allowing people to connect to the wolf as an individual being and follow the story of this wolf and understand that the conflicts that are going on and the threats to the wolf and the beauty of living in an environment where wolves can survive. I think one of the key indicators of a healthy ecosystem is, are there carnivores? Are there wolves? That is a great system of an ecosystem that's doing okay.
And do we know why the wolf has moved like that? I guess habitat destruction in Oregon?
Some of the time, these wolves are following ancient trails. They
Oh,
they go a long way to find a family, to find a mate. They mate for life, and as long as their mate is alive, and they build their family and they grow their pack, which is basically just a family. And they go a long way to do so, and they migrate and they move through the seasons. That's how they find food and that's how they survive. So this is not necessarily habitat destruction. It's a good thing for wolves to move around, and it's them, sort of filtering out through their ancient ecosystems. And so it's just wonderful to see.
cool. And with the tracking, is there an element of protection for the wolf then, do you think?
It goes both ways. It's controversial. It goes both ways. People feel like, as we're tracking the wolf and we're reporting where the wolf is, it could put the wolf in harm's way from those who would do harm to the wolf. And so the Department of Fish and Wildlife tends to be very vague about where the wolf is. They work with the local ranchers and say, like, look, a wolf might be in your territory. We're taking care of it. You don't need to go vigilante on this. It's going to be fine. So that's a hard job. But then they also don't tell the public specifically where the wolf is. But kind of people paying attention, you have a good idea, or maybe you go out and track a wolf. Like, how exciting is it to bring your child out and look for wolf prints, which I've done before. And it's just a wonderful thing to be able to do when we didn't have wolves when I was growing up. They haven't returned for a century, and now here they are struggling to come back. We have several families that are struggling. We lost the Shasta pack, but this Lassen pack and its descendants are doing okay. So there's multiple views on the collar. I don't like to see a wild animal with a collar. It's hard to see, but I also know that I'm just so rooting for this wolf to survive and all of hopefully his future family.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know with the deer, it came down to culling them was what was on the table, and so the alternate suggestion was birth control basically, which of course they do to the female, and of course a lot of people didn't like that idea either, but it's better than culling. Like, unfortunately, in these urban settings, sometimes we have to make those compromises, right? So they
It's
get.
true of, mountain lions, wolves, so forth. As we spread out with our urban development and go into their territory, they have less and less territory. So of course they're going to come down. Also, as climate change worsens, of course they're going to come down. So there's a big push, not only to make people less afraid. I mean, wolves and bears and mountain lions, they're not going to harm people It's just almost never happens. It's not what they're after, believe it or not. And so try to calm down that reaction, try to figure out how to, encourage people getting excited about this, but also to build wildlife corridors. That's policy that we're really pushing for, to restore and conserve land so that there can be connectivity between places. So like this wolf, for example, can't just stay up in the hills somewhere. This wolf needs to migrate, as do bison, as do large cats and so forth. They need to move around a little bit. Large cats have smaller territories, but some of these animals have big territories. Bison, for example, in Yellowstone National Park, you can't just expect that they're going to stay in the park. Of course, they're going to move outside the boundaries, right? So you need to have a buffer zone. And currently, there are people waiting with guns right on the boundary of the park to pick off, not bison particularly, but wolves. And so we need to stop, I think, first of all, giving the animal agriculture industry, which doesn't really do great things for people or the planet, to stop giving so much priority in wildlife policy. Like, why would they be more important than the survival of bison and wolves that the majority of people want to survive and thrive? So yeah, but anyway, wildlife connectivity and corridors are very important, as well as crossings over interstates and that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Cool. And there's no end to the work that you get to do there at the Center for Biological Diversity. Jennifer, can you tell us what else you're working on? Is there anything else you want to say before we go?
Yeah, ultimately, I hope that my job is put out of existence. Like, I hope that we don't need my job. That would be my best future, is that we have this just food system where we no longer need people fighting for sustainable food. You can learn more about the work that I do at takeextinctionoffyourplate.com or earthfriendlydiet.com. It's the same. I write that Food X newsletter where you can kind of learn about some of the greenwashing that's going on and some of the future trends that are positive. And if you're curious about what you want to eat, what's more sustainable, what's the best kind of option, where that comes down, I often share a lot of resources, that kind of thing. Continue to work on all of the things that I'm talking about. We just launched a wool report that people might be interested in called Sheer Destruction. We love this title, right? We're always into puns. But Sheer Destruction exposes the environmental cost of wool. We often talk about like the animal, welfare aspect of wool, or the environmental cost of like beef, for example, or sheep meat, but the fashion industry bears responsibility too. So we're calling on brands and designers to start phasing out wool and instead invest in alternative materials that are better for animals and the planet. And you can learn about that at sheerdestruction.com.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks so much for taking the time today, Jennifer.